Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvot la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. La'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so we're in Genesis 29. It's Vayetze is the name of the parsha. And before we can go into Bilhah and Zilpah, we need to just review a little bit Rachel and Leah. So who knows the story of Rachel and Leah and these two sisters and the backstory of them?
Well, it was the uncle made him marry Leah after 7 years. And then he had to work Jacob had to work another 7 years until he got the one he wanted, which was Rachel.
Okay, so
quick story.
Jacob ran away from his brother and his family and went back home. We talked about Rebecca, to his uncle Laban, who was Rebecca, his mother's brother. And at the well, because the well is the scene of love in the Torah, he sees Rachel, beautiful girl, and she is watering her flocks, and he helps her lift off. He's so strong. There's a huge stone on the mouth of the well. He can lift it up by himself because, he's showing off for her. And he falls madly in love with her, and she's so beautiful. And it turns out she's his first cousin. And she brings him home to her father, who is Jacob's uncle, and he says, I'm in love with Rachel and I want to marry her. And the uncle says, her father says, well, you have to work for me for 7 years if you want to marry my daughter. Mm-hmm. And he did. And it says the time flew because he was so in love. So it comes the wedding day, and Rachel has an older sister named Leah. And all we know about Leah is they say she has a Nayim Rakot. It can mean weak eyes or soft eyes. Something was with her eyes. And I always think in the Middle East, or even you look at today, Muslim women, you cover your face, in front of strange men. And what do we see?
Just the
eyes. So if you have beautiful eyes, that's a big attraction. If you have cross eyes or soft eyes or weak eyes, it's not going to be that attractive. And so also, the rabbis say the reason she had weak eyes is that she knew that her sister was supposed to marry Jacob, and she was supposed to marry Esau, his older brother, who was not a good guy, and she was crying her whole life because of that. That's their excuse. Anyway, it's interesting. So what happens on the wedding night? Who knows? Somebody knows. Cindy.
Leah is wearing a thick veil, and when Jacob, it comes the time in the ceremony to lift the veil. At that point, he realizes he's marrying the wrong woman.
He's married. It's after the wedding that he finds out that he's married the wrong woman. And she had a thick veil. And he says to Laban, how could you do this? I loved Rachel. And he said, well, I can't marry off the younger sister before I marry off the older sister. So if you want to marry Rachel, wait a week, like for the Sheva Brachos, so wait a week, you can marry her and work for me another 7 years, which he agreed. That is why in weddings, traditionally in Jewish weddings, there's a ceremony called the Bedekin, where the groom comes and expects the wife, the fiance, before she puts on the veil. He comes in and he goes, okay, yeah, it's my Rachel. It's not somebody else. And to this day, there's a ceremony where the groom helps put on the veil after he's inspected the bride from this story. Yes, Lori, did you want to say something?
Yeah. Does that mean that he had two wives, or did that mean that the first marriage was a no?
Two wives. People took wives all the time.
Right.
Cindy.
As we learned with Rebecca, that a woman has to give consent to a marriage. So that would mean that Leah agreed to this plan.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure she was in love with him from the very beginning. She loved him. I'm sure that he was very attractive, and she loved him too. It's obvious she loved him because she suffered because he did not love her. He did not love her. And we even read this, and I'm going to read you the text. Okay. So then he's married and he works for Rachel. And then it says in the text, God saw that Leah, where is it? I want you to read this. God saw that Leah was unloved, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So before we even get into Zilpah and Bilhah, that's interesting that beauty in the Torah does not get you blessings. Even being loved by your
problem with your
husband.
testimony.
I don't know who that was.
Dan.
Who is it? Somebody speaking?
Stan Greenberg?
He's here.
And Greenberg, but he muted himself then.
Okay. So she's not loved, and God has compassion on her, and she has four sons, one after the other. And Rachel has none. And Rachel goes to her husband, Jacob, and says, give me a child or I will die. Now, it's interesting. There's a parallel in the book of Samuel with Hannah. She has the same thing. And she says to her husband, Elkanah, I am so sad I don't have a child. And Elkanah says, don't I love you more than 10 sons? He's very comforting to her. But Jacob, who he's a very mixed character. He says, he gets mad at her. Jacob is incensed at Rachel and said, can I take the place of God who has denied you the fruit of the womb? He's like, don't blame me. Don't look at me. And yet his father, Yitzchak, prayed for his wife, Rebecca, to have a child. She said, pray for me. And he did. So Jacob is, a little, self-centered, arrogant. He ends up suffering quite a bit in his later years. And we see that he, took the birthright from his brother, ran away. He's been deceived, just like he deceived his father with wives. Okay, so here's where we get to it. And so Rachel says, here's my maid Bilhah. Consort with her that she may bear on my knees, and that through her I may too have children. So she gave her maid Bilhah as a concubine, and Jacob cohabited with her, except some places they say she's a wife, some places they say she's a concubine. Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son, and Rachel said, God has vindicated me. Indeed, he has heard my plea and given me a son. So here we have Rachel saying God gave her a son. What about Bilhah? What about it? She's the one who gave birth. She's the mother. Therefore, she named him Don, which means justice or judgment. And Rachel's Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, a fateful contest I waged with my sister. Yes, and I have prevailed. So she named him Naphtali, which means something like victory or something. So there's this very unpleasant rivalry between the sisters, and Rachel has used Bilhah to one up her sister, Ruth Lynn.
Isn't that the same thing, almost the same as Sarah with Hagar?
Yes.
A repetition? Yeah.
Repetition. But then, then we're going to go to the text I sent you. We just have to know this. When Leia saw that she had stopped bearing, she took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a concubine. And when Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son, Leah said, what luck? And she named him God. And when Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, Leah declared, what fortune? Meaning women will deem me as fortunate. And she named him Asher, which is a pretty common name today. Asher means good fortune or happiness. Okay. So what do we see? These two women used these other two women to compete with each other in terms of fertility. So now let's look, who were they? Sadly, they were their sisters. They were their half sisters that they were using. So that is one of the things that the Midrash says. Okay, so if I open this up and share it with you, and I made it in a very big print. Okay, so I know you have it, so you can either read it from your printout or read me the traditional understanding of the story, just this first two paragraphs. Who would like to read this?
I like to.
Okay, Doris.
Traditional understanding of the story. The 12 tribes of Israel were conceived by 4 women. 2 of them, Rachel and Leah, are lionized in history as the matriarchs of our people. Lesser known are the other two, Bilhah and Zilpah, mothers to Dan, Naphtali, and Gad and Asher. Bilhah and Zilpah were originally Rachel and Leah's handmaids, but when Rachel and Leah struggled to conceive, they proposed that Jacob marry and have children with their handmaids.
So, it goes back and forth that they married them or they were concubines. That's different status, and apparently Bilhah was very beautiful and they were younger sisters. So who were they? Who were these two women? So who would like to read this part? Who were they? Somebody read. I've talked enough.
Okay, I'll read. In biblical times, men often had many wives. Sometimes the wives were of different social castes and would retain that social status after marriage. The woman of the higher caste was considered the man's primary wife, and her children received preferential treatment. When a man married into the slaves caste, on the other hand, the children of their union usually remained slaves. Social anthropologists have coined a rarely used term to describe the practice of a man marrying women from both higher and inferior castes, polycoity.
Polycoity. So, but we know that those 4 sons were not considered slaves ever. And so from that, we can infer that they weren't just concubines or, slaves taken to procreate, but he married them. He married them as well. However, these other women, the superior women, Rachel and Leah, and we love them and they're our matriarchs and blah, blah, blah. They really just co-opted these children, named them, not the mothers, and they claimed them. So it's, okay, so let's just continue this and see.
I have one question here. I think he named it polycoity. It just means lots of coitus.
Yes,
Right.
It doesn't tell you anything. But I think it should be understood. These were the women's, Bilhah and Zilpah were the handmaidens that were given as gifts. Wasn't Laban giving them as gifts when the girls married? So they're not, they're not the same as Hagar, who was the outsider, an Egyptian. These two gals, Bilhah and Zilpah, came from a household.
Yes, but we're going to read later that there is a midrash, or there's some rabbis say they were also the daughters of Lavan.
Yes.
They were daughters by a servant. And so they were his daughters. So they were half sisters to Leah and Rachel, that he gave them to be their handmaidens. So
it's kind of like Jefferson and Sally Hemings.
yes. Yes. They grew up together, and yes, and they grew up together, and suddenly now one is the slave or maidservant to the other. They all were, knew each other as little girls in the same household. So it's, Diane's shaking her head. It's not so nice. Okay, so Susan, why don't you read? Our tradition tells us.
I can read.
Okay, Diane.
I can read it. Our tradition tells us that Laban also had at least 2 wives. Most traditions assert that Laban's second inferior wife was a concubine, while others posit that she was actually his maidservant. Leah and Rachel were sisters born of Laban's primary wife, and Bilhah and Zilpah were daughters of his second wife, making Bilhah and Zilpah the half-sisters of Rachel and Leah. Before they married, Laban gifted Bilhah and Zilpah to Leah and Rachel as handmaidens. In Hebrew, Amah or Shifcha.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So they were half sisters, these little younger girls, probably, because, he probably had said, okay, he probably was hoping for sons, and he had 2 girls and he said, all right, well, let me try with this other woman. Let me get some sons. He didn't. He got 2 more girls. And so he gave them over to his primary daughters as handmaids, servants, slaves. There's all different translations. Okay, read a little more, Diane.
Okay, Bilhah means to become alarmed.
Lehi Bahel.
Lehi Bahel. Bilhah was named so because of her stunning beauty. Zilpah means to flow. Lezalef.
Lezalef, right.
This name provided to be prophetic, as when Zilpah was told as a young girl that she was destined to join Leia in her marriage to the Esau. Yeah, tears would flow down her face.
Okay, so this is, kind of like the traditional understanding. So they really paint Esau, evil Esau. I mean, he was maybe an oaf or a bumpkin or not that bright, but he wasn't horrible, but they have to justify what Jacob did to him. And, they're actually mixing their stories, because it says that the father Laban gave these girls to his daughters at their wedding. And now they're saying she knew since she was a little girl. So yeah. Okay. Okay. So now here's the story of how it happens, and that we learn all about their interactions, but there's no. Okay. Let's just talk for a minute. I want to stop the share. Let's just think about how these two girls felt. What do you think? What could we imagine they felt when they were given to be wives to Jacob? I mean, do you think they thought it was terrible? Do you think they thought it was a step up? Do you think they thought it was a curse, a blessing? What do you imagine their feeling was about it? Leslie.
Well, even though they might have known this was their destiny or similar from birth because they were from the second wife, they can't have been very happy about it. They grew up playing with the girls as equals, and now they have to be subservient and do whatever they're told to do at this point. And they're really half sisters. They had one parent was the same.
Right.
And
it had to be hard for them, I would think.
Yeah. I mean, from in the 21st century, I'm horrified.
Of course.
Like I was last time. But
and that's the good news. It doesn't happen anymore. So there's the good news.
That we know of.
Yeah, that's true. Also, though, all right, let me hear what else you have to say. Who else has an opinion? Ruth.
I think that it was perfectly in keeping with the way women were treated at that time. They were property. They were given in exchange for territory, for more animals. They had absolutely no rights whatsoever. So these girls, probably it was a step up for them. At least they got out of Laban's household.
Yes, and that's why it's so rare that Jacob fell in love with Rachel and worked for her. That's very rare and certainly in the Torah, that relationship. Okay, Claudia.
Well, I agree. What if going with their half sisters meant sparing a life of servitude or marriage to women below them or whatever else their destiny had been? So at least they stayed in the family with women they loved and knew.
And near to their children.
And what, Ruth?
And near to their children.
And near to their children. And near to their children. Wait, who else? Susan Ehrlich.
Yes, I think that we in the 21st century need to get into the mindset of people of that era and also of the social customs and social realities. And it from what we think today is different from what was happening before. And I don't think it was as bad because they were born into a caste, but they were well taken care of in this, even as servants there. And I think that they were probably treated well. I mean, it wasn't like Hagar. And polygamy was practiced, and we have to look at multiple marriages. I mean, even in our own time, when there are several wives or two wives of people, and how it's not great for the wives, but this was the reality of those times. So I don't think it was as bad for them as it is for us in the 20th century mindset. And they weren't slaves.
Right.
No, they weren't. Lori, yeah.
I just have a question. It's clear that Jacob is madly in love with Rachel. And how does Rachel feel about Jacob?
Oh, she loved him.
Okay.
She loved him too. I'm sure it was like a love match. Yes, Leslie.
Okay, so that's I agree with all of that, and maybe going to their childhood sisters' homes instead of a stranger is a better thing. But they might not have been slaves, but they had no free will. They could not change this. They had to do what they were told, whether or not they wanted to. And what's the real difference? What's the difference between a slave and a handmaid, hand servant that can't leave, that can't do anything else? Is there a difference?
No, it's the same. I mean, actually, if you remember The King and I, where that beautiful young girl was given to the king and she loved this other man, and she was, she was given to the king as like, I don't know what number wife, and she ran away and she ended up dying or whatever. But the point is that personally, I don't think people are that different ever. And I think, Bilhah and Zilpah, they were given as servants. Maybe they had no choice. Doesn't mean they were happy about it, especially if Bilhah was stunningly beautiful. I'm sure she had suitors, or maybe loved some other young man, but she had no choice. And then because I actually cut this out of this interpretation, how it said that they were so happy to give their children to Rachel and Leah and help them, have more children for Jacob. I can't imagine they were happy that their children were considered the children of these half sisters, though they were probably the nannies to their own children. They were probably the wet nurses, just like, Moses's mother was a slave and was the wet nurse to Moses. And I guess they got, as Susan Ehrlich said, they got to be near their children and see their children, but we don't really know how much claim or how close they were able to be to their children. And I don't think that changes in 10,000 years about the way you feel. You just reconcile yourself, or you're unhappy. Some people can live with it and some people can't. Yes, Pamela. Yeah.
So I'm wondering how we reconcile the reality of women's lives back during this time with the general lack of economic freedom that everybody had, right? It's not like anybody, male or female, could go to work, bring home money, go to the grocery store and buy their goods and pay their rent or their mortgage or whatever it is. So I'm wondering if your lot in life was, it's almost like your job, right? As a woman, your job as a woman is to be in the richest man's household that you can secure. So maybe it's the highest paid job in 2021, or if that's what your goal is. And so if your lot in life, let's say you're an immigrant from some other country, what if you then work in a household like we have all over Los Angeles? To your point of, I don't think things change that much. I think if you look at it from an economics perspective, it's not really so different. And it's maybe more offensive because it isn't different in a way, right? More offensive today. But, and so, I mean, these women were raised together as sisters. And, I don't know if everybody read The Red Tent from like a gazillion years ago when that came out. Women really sort of kept to themselves and were communal. And if these 4 women were raised as sisters, some being preferred, so we're told, some not, and basically their dad said, look, take the lot of them. I can't afford to feed them. They're no use to me in the field. Take them all. And that's kind of the vibe that I get when I read about it, which is they need, their servants, so to speak, but also these four, they're bonded. Like, when you adopt two cats that are supposedly bonded, you take them together. Not to say that these people are cats, but I love my cats, so it's kind of the same. Anyway, so I guess my only point as I recall is that, yes, we can look at it like these are my children, your children, but if you raise your children together in a communal sense, don't they all become our children?
That's a good point. It could be. It could be.
I mean, it might not be at all. And I'm sure there's infighting with that, because we don't all always get along with our siblings, right? So
you see the infighting between Hagar and Sarah. So that's one model, and their sons were, they kept their sons away from each other. And then there's this model of where they're all living together and perhaps they're all raising each other's children. And in the red tent, we get that they all raised Dinah, the one daughter. They were all very close to the one daughter. But you're right. We don't know. So it's interesting to look at it from all the different points of view. But we have no words from Bilhah and Zilpah ever in the Torah. So let's just go back to that for a second. Where's the share? And
yeah, I mean, just to be clear, I'm not saying that those two people aren't second class, if you will.
No,
but just that it might not have as horrific as we are perceiving it with our own eyes today.
I think you're right. Okay, so why don't you read here the story? Jacob marries the maidservants.
All right, let me see if I can make this.
Or you?
Okay, no, I can read it. I just had to
okay,
get some faces off the screen. Okay, Jacob marries the maidservants. One could assume that a young bride would be opposed to having her husband marry her maid. What events led Jacob's wives to offer their handmaids to him in marriage? At the beginning of her marriage, Rachel could not conceive, despite her desire to have Jacob's children and be part of the future he was trying to build. The pain of her childlessness was exacerbated when she watched her sister Leia birth not one, but 4 children, one after the other.
Hold on, let's move this so that everybody can see. Okay.
Rachel became jealous of her sister. Besides envying the children she had begotten, Rachel attributed Leah's fertility to her righteousness and envied the good deeds Leah must have done to merit offspring.
So there's nothing of that in the text. This is the Orthodox view that Leah, it says God saw that she was unhappy and opened her womb, that she was righteous. But we have not one act of righteousness by either sister anywhere. So this is just projection on the matriarchs. Keep going.
Give me children, Jacob, she cried to her husband. If not, I am as good as dead. Rachel was so stricken that she thought she would die from grief.
Also, the rabbis say, or commentary says, that if you have no children, your memory, you die with yourself, as opposed to your children carry on your legacy, your memory, your genetics. Well, they don't know genetics, but they carry on your name and your bloodline. So without children, she is like dead, she feels, because there's nothing to carry her on after she's gone.
Well, and isn't also just like it really shows a woman's worth. Our purpose in society at that time was, and some places still is, just being a mother and birthing babies, and male babies at that.
Yes. And a lot of places still, when young couples get married, one of the first questions say, well, when are you having kids? When are you having kids? There's this assumption it's your obligation until you say otherwise to have children. Okay. Continue. One more.
Mirroring her grandmother Sarah, who gave Abraham her maidservant Hagar, Rachel hoped that she would merit to have children if she did this. At the very least, Rachel hoped to help raise Bilhah's children as her own, mitigating some of the pain she was experiencing. Thus, Rachel set Bilhah free and Jacob married her.
Okay, so here again, this is not in the text, but this is what the commentaries say. So she wasn't a concubine, she was a wife, because we can't just otherwise the children would be slave children or inferior, and the Torah wants them all to be equal. Continue.
In time, Bilhah bore 2 children, and Rachel named them Dan, judgment, and Naphtali, contest or prayer.
We know that there was this, I have to have children because my sister has to have children, which shows it wasn't a totally harmonious household of the 4.
To say the least.
There was, because there's this, oh yeah, you're having kids, well, I'm going to have kids back and forth. Perhaps ultimately, once they both were mothers, it died down. Who would like to read this part now?
Wait, can I just ask a question?
Oh yeah, of course.
Sorry, I'm inquisitive.
No, wait. Yeah.
So just, I'm wondering about the definition of marriage back in the day, meaning like, was there a ceremony, or was literally just the consummation the actual marriage? So that when we translate gave them to him in marriage, does that mean really he said, okay, go have sex with him, and then that's the marriage? Like,
well, I don't know when the ketubah or the marriage contract started, but we know with Isaac and Rebecca, it just says that, he took her into his tent and he married her and he loved her. So it seems like the consummation of marriage, sex, is marriage. Basically, yes, Lori.
With the class that Rabbi Leader did last fall, I think it was, something came up about this issue. And until there was a time in Jewish history when there was a marriage ceremony, having sex with someone was getting married.
Yeah.
So that was true in Abraham's time, but I'm not sure about now. How much later is this? A couple of generations?
No, this is early.
Right.
It's this. Right. This is just it. This will go on for a really long time.
Well, if that's true, then what's a concubine? Then all concubines are wives. Because
you're right, but there must be some,
like a caste system.
Because he did.
Was there a dowry?
Would Jacob just go, I marry you, now let's go have sex? And to the concubine, he just said, I just want a good time tonight. And that's the end of it?
Perhaps. I don't know. I want to look at that, but it seems like a concubine doesn't have to be willing.
I would also think that there's an obligation if you marry someone to take care of them financially.
Yes.
Whereas a concubine, I think, is throwaway. Like, you don't have any obligations to house and clothe and feed, right? And care for their children. So I think, to me, if you give someone in marriage before there was a marriage ceremony or ketubah, what you're really saying is she's going to give it to him, but he has to take care of her financially. Because if I give her up as my slave, which is my obligation to care for them financially and feed them and clothe them, etc., then it now becomes my husband's obligation. I don't know. That's just
okay. So I just thought of something. So this could be a hint. Remember that the bride of Jacob wore a veil, so he didn't know who she was. So perhaps when you marry someone, there's some kind of, you veil yourself and you come forward and you say, come into, or whatever. But it seems we do have this thing about the veil mentioned with Rachel and Leia. That's how he got the wrong sister, because she was veiled. So there had to have been some kind of ceremony, no matter how brief. We don't know what it is, but it implies there was some kind of ceremony, and then when you had sex, that was the
seal.
Susan, last parasha was Rebecca, and when she saw Isaac in the field,
she may have veiled herself,
which they say indicated that she was going to be his bride. And in terms of caring for the issue that Pamela raised, which was a good one, there were all sorts of laws. Now, that, of course, that came later with in Exodus with the commandments, but there were laws about treating women when you get them as spoils in war. You're supposed to take care of them and give them financially. And there were also laws about betrothed. that if you're, which is engaged, and they're considered wives. And there are also laws about if you have sex with a woman, then the man has to, out in the fields or something, then the man has to marry her and provide for her. So were there all these provisions? And I'm thinking in terms of ceremony, Laban had a feast after he gave his daughters away, or didn't he? He had some kind of a party. So I think there were rituals, and there was also the bride price that came with it. So there were certain rituals.
I mean, yeah, he worked 7 years. That was the bride price.
Right.
So there were these things, there were these rituals, but being officially married was the sex act. You know what I mean? Let's say,
Yes.
saying once you had sex with her, she was your wife. All of this was part of it. But I think there was some kind of, I agree, ceremonial aspect that probably Bilhah and then Zilpah underwent. Yes, Ruth Lynn. You're muted.
I'm going to skip forward to Dina because she obviously had some kind of relations with
Shem.
Shem. So that wasn't a marriage.
No, it was a rape.
Yeah. Or
but then, you know, the father of the guy came and said, let's make them married. Let's consider
it a marriage, but they had obviously had sex before, so that wasn't a marriage yet. So there had to be some ritual.
Exactly. There had to be some ritual. It wasn't just if you rape someone, she's your wife. I mean, because then they talk about rape and monetary compensation, actually.
So what's the difference? There doesn't seem to be a lot of free will here, especially on the part of the women. You say, oh, they went willingly. A bride, a wife was more willing than maybe a slave or a hand servant, but none of them seem to be really willing. And what's the difference as a definition, or even at the time, between a rape and a marriage? I mean, the man could say, oh, well, I raped her, but I really meant to marry her.
Okay, but what we're sort of parsing out is that marriage means some kind of ceremony, some kind of payment, perhaps a dowry as well, and some kind of official celebration or acceptance by the community. Because when they talk about rape in the Torah, they say if a woman is raped and or has sex with a man, you have to compensate the father. You can marry her if she wants to marry. If not, she doesn't have to marry and you have to pay money. I mean, there are these laws around forcible rape as opposed to consensual sex. You know what I mean? Now, consensual sex doesn't mean your father didn't say to you, you have to marry him, young lady. And that's, I've decided that, and she goes along with it. But there is some kind of more ceremonial aspect than just raping a woman. Sorry, let me just get rid of
Maybe the consent is the father's consent, not the woman's consent, not the father's. But I think the concept of the obligation to care for the woman financially after the fact is probably incredibly significant in the difference between a rape or concubine. I think you're right.
I think you're right. Okay, let's go on because we haven't even gotten to the anthropological part of this yet, which is very interesting.
All right.
So I'm just going to say that I'm going to read this quickly after we get to the anthropology. After Leia saw Rachel's success, Nachmanides, who's Ramban, says she too desired more children and they were prophetesses. This is not Orthodox, so I don't agree. And knew that Jacob was only destined to have 12 sons to ensure the majority of those boys would be born by her or handmaid, even though she already had 4 children at the time, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Leah offered Zilpah to Jacob in marriage. It appears that she made the offer half-heartedly, hoping he would refuse. Zilpah gave birth to 2 children, and Leah named them Gad and Asher. And then Rachel eventually gave birth to 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. And here's something interesting. Rachel died in childbirth, Benjamin. And according to this Midrash, Bilhah raised Rachel's children as her own. So she was considered, I guess she had a lot of status. She then became the mother to all of those children, Rachel's 2 children and her 2 children. So, okay, so now let's look at the anthropological understanding. We know this part that they had no children. Okay, so this is interesting. She says, behold, my maid Bilhah, go unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I also may have children. Okay, so now it says here, somebody read this part. In biblical times, this was an acceptable way for a married woman who was barren to gain children. In an ancient Nuzi, I don't know what community that is, contract, it stipulated that marriage contract, a woman whose servant bore the children of her husband should have full authority over the offspring. This adoption ceremony was often conducted by placing the son or daughter on the knees of the mistress and declaring it her child. This may have been what Rachel meant when she said, Bilhah shall bear upon my knees. So when she said that, she meant that then it'll be like my child. So she was taking the child as her own. Then I showed you like these photos of women giving birth in ancient times. You see them in these 2 photos or images. She may have been just referring to the way in which ancient women commonly gave birth. Women in labor were surrounded by female companions who encouraged them to labor upright and dance and sway during contractions. Belly dancing is actually an ancient fertility dance that women were taught at a young age to help with conception and labor. I did not know that. And during the final stage of labor, a woman would squat and be supported under the arms by 1 or 2 other women. Oftentimes, bricks were placed under her to give her more support, and the midwife knelt in front of her. And this image of a woman being supported in a squat by other women is the most common image of women giving birth throughout history and around the world. So when Rachel meant that Bilhah would bear upon her knees, she may have been referring to the actual position in which she would give birth. Here they are. And in the red tent, Anita Diamond imagines Rachel being a very skilled midwife. Because she didn't have children of her own, she became a midwife, which is a very interesting idea, that she would help deliver other children. And that she taught Dinah how to do that. Either way, it is most certain that Rachel would have been with Bilhah during the birth of her 2 sons. Also, the scriptural text seems to indicate that the sons of Bilhah that Bilhah bore were considered to be Rachel's, and that she would have raised them as her own. This is reinforced by the fact that Rachel named both the sons Bilhah bore. Now, I want to talk to you about that. If you know the story of the book of Ruth, it's very weird. Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, names her son. And when Ruth finally has a son, the women say, behold, Naomi has a son. So there was something very odd about the superior woman claiming the motherhood of the lesser powerful woman as her own. And so again, we wonder, how did Bilhah and Zilpah feel about this fact that the women claimed their children and named their children, and they never said anything. They never said anything, but we are learning. So I want to jump to this other incident that is kind of a shocking incident, and most people don't know it because it's only 1 sentence. And let's look at this here. Where is it? Okay. Okay, here it is. Okay, now this is interesting. First of all, who wants to read this Reuben and Bilhah thing? Somebody just read this. Leslie, why don't you read it? Tell me, you're going to love this, Leslie. I mean, and I say that ironically.
I'll read it. In
Hey, Leslie.
Talmudic times, the Torah was read in Hebrew, and then in the colloquial Aramaic, thank you, so that the congregation was being said.
Nice.
The reader chanted a verse in Hebrew, and then in Mitugarian translator would repeat it in Aramaic. The Mishnah lists 4 biblical stories that should not be translated lest they be misinterpreted by the unlearned. One of them is the story of Reuben and Bilhah.
Okay, the verse simply states, and it came to pass when Israel, that's Jacob, sojourned in that land, and that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. Now she's a concubine again. And Israel, meaning Jacob, heard of it. So it is this one sentence, suddenly, Reuben, the oldest son, Rachel has died. Reuben goes and has sex with Bilhah. She's the beautiful younger servant of Rachel. And why? Why did he do that? And how do we feel about that? And the Orthodox, I love it because they can never just condemn. They always have to justify. And so here's their understanding of it. That's not what really happened. He didn't lie with her. But there's 2 understandings of it. After Rachel died, Jacob started sleeping more with Bilhah, who was Rachel's, servant. And Reuben, who was the son of Leia, was furious that his father was not going to his mother now, that his bed was in Rachel's tent the whole time. And now he moved it to Bilhah, and that Reuben actually took out the bed and put it in Leia's room, in Leia's tent, because he said, how should, the servant be more important than my mother? That he didn't actually sleep with her. Another idea is he slept with her so that he wouldn't sleep with Bilhah anymore. He kind of defiled Bilhah, so his father would move to Leia in order to say, you have to be with my mother, not with this servant. Another interpretation, which is more anthropological, is that he was claiming authority as the oldest son. His father was old by sleeping with his wife, or sleeping with his concubine. And there's a story in the book of Samuel. When you study King David, which we did in Women's Torah Study a few years ago, he was really a mixed character. Well, his son Absalom was rebelling against him. He drove David out of the palace in Jerusalem, and then he went on the roof of the palace and had sex in public view with 10 of his father David's concubines. So I'm in charge now, and these women belong to me. So there's this idea that Reuben is saying, my father is old, I'm the oldest son, I'm stepping up, and the way I'm saying this is I am asserting my superiority and my primary status by sleeping with my father's primary concubine, because obviously it seems like Bilhah was, I guess he loved her even more than Rachel. I mean, Leia, poor Leia, was never.
May I ask you a question, Rabbi? Is that where they get the expression, they can't keep it in their pants?
I'm sure they have that expression many places, but it was a power move. It wasn't a sex move. Mm-hmm. Or the rabbis say it was in honor of his mother, Leia, to say, you can't sleep with this servant, you must sleep with my mother. She's your more important wife. So,
so he's running around sleeping with everyone to assert his superiority. Isn't that a bunch of rapes?
With Reuben, okay, and yes, that was considered by some rabbis a rape. And there's this fantastic, there's this book called The Woman's Torah Commentary, and every parsha, there's an interpretation by another woman rabbi. And there's this great rabbi named Rabbi Leia Bass, who I never heard of, but I looked her up. She's quite prominent. And she writes about this, and she says, none of the commentators deal directly with Bilhah. Their main focus is to condemn Reuben for sleeping with his father's concubine. In other words, for utilizing his father's property. Because, he doesn't become the firstborn. When Jacob dies, he says, you're no longer the firstborn. And it was perhaps because of this. But it says, we would not wish that Bilhah was raped. What will we gain from the Bible by having yet another story of humiliation and pain? Oh yeah. So she believes that she was raped because in Hebrew, there's when somebody sleeps with someone, they say im, vayishkav im, it means you slept with, and vayishkav et means to, you did something to the person. So this rabbi says he didn't lay with her, he laid her.
Mhm.
He laid her. So that is considered rape. And so then this rabbi says that the Torah, in all three instances of this kind of rape, the men are killed. They are killed. They are punished. So Reuben is disinherited from his firstborn status for this. Amnon, who rapes his sister, this is on King David had so many children that there were a lot of half siblings, and one half brother rapes his half sister. He dies. And then Shem, who rapes Dinah, which we'll learn about next in 2 weeks, he dies. He's killed. So this rabbi concludes that the rapists are always punished. They're never rewarded. But that Bilhah was raped, in her opinion. Yes, Leslie. And then Susan, and then
They're never rewarded. They're all killed. No, they're not,
these stories in the Torah, not all rapists in the world.
No. But even in the Torah, I mean, you could, going back to last time, Hagar, was she raped?
No, she was not raped. She was given status of a wife. She was, loved. And according to the Midrash, after Sarah
Eventually she was, though, right? I mean, she was given here. Sarah says, here, you take my.
But he married her. He married her, and she had a lot of status. Her son was given a lot of status. In fact, she had so much status, she was putting down Sarah. Mm-hmm. And Abraham wasn't doing anything about it. So
I'm just wondering, at first, if she willingly did. And maybe she did. Maybe she was like, "Ooh, this is my way out of this pickle."
It's not the same as a son raping his mother's wife. His father's wife, sorry.
Right. Yeah.
It's different. Okay. Who had their hand up? Susan and then Lori. Go ahead.
Reuben was the firstborn and was to inherit his father's mantle, and it says now Jacob was old as well. So to me, that's very much a power thing.
It was a power thing.
And they've said that before. And then also we might consider whether these others, we're talking about rape for the Bilhah and Zilpah. Who's to say they didn't like Jacob?
No, I'm not
we
saying.
Don't know that. And he was wealthy and he was a leader, and they wouldn't have had they didn't have the status in the caste system to be his first wives. But who's to say? We don't know. We all say, oh, they're raped and wasn't that awful? But we actually don't know.
We don't say that Jacob raped them. He married them.
That's right. And so we don't know when you say how did they.
No one implies that they were raped. We're talking about
so I thought that was the implication of and
Reuben raped Bilhah is what there's a suggestion. Right. Reuben raped Bilhah, and that two other instances, Shem raped Dinah.
Right.
Amnon raped Tamar. That's in the book of Samuel.
That we know. And we know her, I'm just saying her reactions, because some of the comments here were that, they were given to Jacob and they didn't have any say. What do they like? We don't know whether they actually liked him or craved him. We don't know their feelings. We know Tamar's with Amon's feelings because she was decrying it. Don't rape. It's not, leave me alone. It's not right for a brother to rape a sister. David's daughter, Tamar.
Right.
That
Yeah.
Tamar.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, Lori, did you want to say something?
I'm going to throw a monkey wrench into this discussion and ask, when was it decided what incest was?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's in the Torah. When you get the 10 Commandments, there's a bunch of laws that say you may not lie with your aunt, your sister, your this.
Right. So this is before.
I mean, there's an implication that Abraham and Sarah were half siblings. You know what I mean? Some Midrash say that. I don't know if that's true, and we know in ancient Egypt, royal siblings did marry each other, brother and sister, to keep the pharaoh pharaonic bloodline pure. And then of course they probably had all kinds of, physical and mental issues because of that. But this is not literal incest. It's just an insult to rape or sleep with your father's wife. You know what I mean? It's not incest. It's a power move. Or the rabbis try to say he's trying to protect his mother, which I wonder. Yes. Anyone else? Yes, Pamela.
So just a quick thought, which is, what is the relative age of the two people? Because it's possible that they were closer in age, even though it was rape because it was wrong to sleep with one of your daddy's wives. Maybe there was, and this is not written anywhere that I'm aware of, but maybe it's possible that she wasn't so unwilling about the whole process simply because Jacob was old and probably not serving that function anymore. And if she was closer, if he's the oldest and she's a young maidservant, they could be very close in age. And I don't know, maybe there was some willingness involved there, even though it doesn't seem to say that. And then certainly I think it's a power move. I don't think there's anything but a power move in my mind about it, but.
Right. I mean, we have no way of knowing because these two women have no voices. They never speak. So we don't know, but that certainly would be a desecration and adultery. It's adultery, which is, punishable by death. Yet there's no mention that she's ever punished or anything. So it tends to imply a kind of a victimization to me, as opposed to willing, because there was no punishment. But Reuben did get punished. He kind of got cursed and disinherited as the oldest. So it seems like the blame from the text is on Reuben and not on Bilhah. So any other comments or questions about these two women who basically are matriarchs? They have 4 sons. And one of the reasons, I don't think it's logical, but sometimes they say the reason they're not honored is because the 4 tribes that descended from them were of the 10 lost tribes. But, they were 4 of the lost tribes that were conquered by Assyria and taken into captivity. But there were other tribes too, of Rachel and, well, no, not Rachel. Rachel's children, Joseph's 2 sons inherited, Manasseh and Ephraim. And then Benjamin became part of Judah, that they merged together. So that's all we know. So that's the story of Bilhah and Zilpah, 2, women who never spoke, but there's a lot about them and a lot of relationship. And I think it's important to know about them as much as to know about Rachel and Leah. So it was a pleasure to study with you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
And
Thank you so much, Rabbi. This is great.
About Dina. And Dina is very interesting, and the rabbis have a lot to say about Dina. I mean, the Midrash and everything. So have a beautiful week. And
you too.
Shalom early, and thank you for studying together.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
This is
Really,
great.
really
Thank you.
enjoy
Bye.
it. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.